After Leeds, I joined a small practice in Bristol. There are about 30 staff. So the level of work was similar to the sort of work I'd worked on in London, small projects. And after 5 years, I can remember checking the reinforcement against the bending schedule. I thought, I can't do this anymore, it's just so boring. So I fortunately had the opportunity to join the newly formed Bristol Polytechnic, now the University of the West of England, as the principal lecturer in structural engineering. My first class was preparing students for the final examination of the Institution of Structural Engineers, now called the Charter Membership Examination. And this is a very profound test of ability because you have to do about a week's work in a day. You have to be able to interpret the client brief and come up with a sound, safe, buildable structure. So I chose a past paper, and one of the questions, which was a reinforced concrete solution, we worked out the structural arrangement, and I said, okay, stick some loads on now, and we'll draw the bending moment diagram, and we can start to size the structural members. And I had great difficulty in doing this. So I tested it on a few other groups within the department, and similar level of struggle. So I devised a test which consisted of 20 what looked like fairly simple beams and frames, no dimensions, just the structure and loading. And I was asking the people I was testing to draw the bending moment diagram. I didn't mind what else they drew, but that's what I was going to judge. And the results were very poor. Now, I happened to be up in London at a meeting with Peter Dunnican again of the Arup Partnership, and in passing I mentioned I'd had this difficulty at Bristol, and he said, well, what do you mean? So I showed him the test, and I said, you know, my students found it difficult to solve these problems. And so I said, would your graduates be able to solve them? And they took in about 200 graduates a year from the best universities in the country, took them through the schedule of how Arabs did calculations and so on. And he looked at me as if I was crazy. He said, what are you talking about? He said, these are trivial questions. Of course they'd be able to solve them. And then I asked the question that actually changed my life, and I said, can I test them? Now, as a very inexperienced academic, I'd only been in the job a year, I didn't realize the significance of being able to get to a group of people you haven't yourself taught. Now, I think Peter had a very similar background to myself. I don't think he had a first degree. But here he was, you know, the managing director of one of the leading consultancies in the world, and I think he got a bit fed up with academics looking down their nose at him. Anyway, he said, well, yes, I suppose so, yeah. So I said, what sort of score do you think they'll get? He said, oh, well, 90, 100%, yeah. Okay. So I turned up next September, gave them the test. The score result was a mean of 37%. Some fluttering in the dovecots. Ah, yes, Peter said, yeah, it's your test. Yeah. I said, what do you mean? I mean, these are just lines on a piece of paper. He said, no, that's got to be it, you see, because we know they can do it. Okay. So I'll come back next year. Yeah. Repeat the exercise, same result. Ah, said Peter, we know the answer to this. You see, because you're testing them in September, but they graduated in June. I said, hold on a minute. I'm not asking them to remember some complex formula. I'm just saying, here's a structure, stick a load on it. What happens? He said, no, that's got to be it, you see, because we know they can do it. Oh, okay. I came out the next year, I tested them, gave them the results of the test, came back and tested them again. Same result. So now we know they can't do it. I don't know why they can't do it, and nobody else seems to have an explanation. But by that time, the Brohn test had achieved a certain amount of notoriety, and questions were asked. Who is this bloke Brohn anyway? Where does he teach? Bristol Polytechnic? Oh, third division. So I said to Peter, look, it's really not fair of me to come into this acknowledged, extremely bright and able graduates and test them and walk out and say you failed. Will you commission me to develop a course that will correct this deficiency? The training department at Arup at that time was run by a guy called Roger Chantrell, and they set up a committee of senior engineers within the practice, and I presented my ideas and the results of the course development to them. And it was interesting because at the end of the day, the chairman of the group said, are they better off for having done this course or not? And the answer generally was, yes, they are better off. And so that course became formalized. I ran it at Arup's for several years. Eventually I got to the point where I'd converted it into a tape-side program for my own students, and Arup's bought 10 copies and have run it themselves internally since that time. But the obvious issue was, why couldn't they solve them? And so I went around a number of departments in the UK and showed them the test and asked whether they thought their graduates would be able to solve them. Generally the view was, well, probably not. But it didn't matter, because once they get into the design office, they'll learn how to do it. And that was reasonable, because I can remember myself when the penny dropped. There were a few who thought it was inappropriate for undergraduate study. You'd get a better result from a polytechnic. We're far too busy solving complex formulae to draw diagrams. Anyway, eventually, with some considerable trepidation, I went to the engineering department at Cambridge University, acknowledged to be at that time certainly the leading engineering institution in the country. And many of the graduates at Arup's were graduates from that department. I was meeting a Chinese lecturer called Q Kong, who was responsible for teaching structural analysis, and I showed him my test. I said, do you think your graduates would be able to solve that? And he said, oh yes, absolutely, yeah. And I must admit, I was absolutely shocked, because that was the first academic who'd said that. And I said, why? Why will they be able to solve them? And he said, because I spent the whole of the first year teaching them to solve them. Right. Leading institution in the UK, perhaps I'm onto something. I then had the opportunity to take a year's leave of absence. I had 3 children at primary school at the time, and so I knew it would be a while before I found that sort of money to make such an exotic trip, because we wanted to go to the Far East. And my head of department had found me a place at Hong Kong Polytechnic, and so we set off beginning of September and stayed in Delhi for a week on the way. The most exciting week. We did everything. Taj Mahal, Agra, Fatehpur Sikri. Amazing. Anyway, I eventually arrived at the Polytechnic. Now, Hong Kong, of course, was a colony at that time, and as an emissary of the government, I was sent a booklet called Chinese Creeds and Customs, the first chapter of which was the business of losing face. Now, this is not an issue in the West any longer, but for those of you who have worked with people in the Far East, you'll know it's very, very important not to place them in a position where they will lose face. The degree at Hong Kong Polytechnic was 4 years, structural engineering. The degrees in the UK were only 3 years. So I decided that I would test the beginning of the 4th year, and so that would be equivalent to testing the graduates in the UK. Now, that course had been taught by a Chinese lecturer, And I was very conscious of this business of losing face, and I thought, well, I must give him a chance to look at the test. So I showed him the test, and I said, you know, will your students be able to solve these problems? He said, oh yes, yes, absolutely. So I said, well, why? Because that's how I teach them. I thought, now that is interesting. That's the second Chinese person in a few months, and that's a quarter of the world's population, so maybe I'm onto something. I tested them. They produced the best score of any group I've ever tested, over 60%. And so sitting down and teaching them was a piece of cake. I was, of course, teaching in English. They spoke perfect English, very, very bright, very keen. And I was on a half teaching, half education technology remit, and in the technology side, that's when I developed the first version of my textbook. After a few weeks, I realized that nobody had asked me a question. So I asked the Chinese lecturer, what's going on? Why don't they ask me a question? He said they can't. Because if they do, they will make you lose face. Because if they have to ask the question, it means that you haven't taught them properly. I thought, wow, that is an interesting observation on the culture. And then a little bit later, I realized that they were using a Chinese textbook. And in that textbook is a series of questions to be solved which were identical to my test.